Let me start by expressing my gratitude to the Beacon Project and Wake Forest University Templeton Religion Trust for making it possible for me to work on this project. It was certainly a highlight of my career. I would say that I'm very skeptical I'll ever work on anything again as an academic that was as enjoyable, rewarding, or fulfilling as it was to work on. My project focused on the character trait, a character trait that I call Others-Centeredness. And the final sort of output of my project is a book on this character trait that has the title of the talk. So what I'll do for my presentation is just take you through some highlights from the book and just try to go chapter by chapter and do this. So I'm obviously leaving out a whole lot of detail, and so some of that will probably come through in the questions. So I'll start with a chapter on the nature of other-centeredness, the nature of this character trait. And there my aim is to offer a clear working definition of other-centeredness as a character trait. Expressed a bit, I start with a kind of colloquial expression, a colloquial account of the nature of the trait, trying to sort of help us to narrow in on the focus. And it goes like this: other-centeredness is a tendency or disposition to treat the interests of each other person as more important than one's own interests for purposes of deciding what to do, just because those interests are someone else's. It's important. I do a lot of work in the first chapter to talk about key conceptual components of this definition and to get us a bit clearer on what on the trait that I'm attempting to identify. I won't walk you through all of those details, but I'll mention a few of them that hopefully will help us to narrow in on the target. So one thing that I'll mention is just that you might think that, well, what I'm saying is that the other-centered person sort of makes a judgment that the interests of others are more valuable than her own interests. That for some interest, that interest belonging to, just because it belongs to someone else, that makes it more valuable than if it belonged to her. That's not what I'm attempting to get at in the definition. Rather, the thought is that the other-centered person, thinking that an interest of her, perhaps thinking that an interest of her own is just as valuable as an interest of another's, nonetheless would allow the interests of others to exercise greater weight in her processes of moral deliberation when she's attempting to decide what to do. So we might then put it a bit more carefully like this, that the other-centered are this way, that for any interest, the other-centered person, takes himself to have more reason to promote that interest, given just that is someone else's, than given just that is her own. Learning about the fact that the interest belongs to someone else is morally relevant for the other-centered person. It pushes them to have otherwise greater reason to pursue promoting that interest. So if you wanted an illustration, you might imagine, suppose you knew a potential action of yours would promote someone's interest, but you didn't know whose, didn't know if it was yours or someone else's. And then you learned that the interest your action would promote was someone else's rather than your own. If you were other-centered, this would give you greater reason for performing the act than if you had instead learned that the interest was your own. Now, that's about all I'm going to do for this talk to try to clarify the nature of the trait. But I'll just, after this last kind of comment about it, that understood in this way, you might think that being other-centered is a kind of way to answer existentially in your own life a question you might take to be somewhat fundamental in the moral life, namely the question of whether I should treat my own interests as more important than others' interests as more important than my own, or my own interests and others' interests as equally important. The other-centered person adopts a characterological orientation that constitutes a way of answering that question existentially in their life. The second chapter, a focus on other-centeredness in the New Testament. There are a number of reasons why I do this. I have a chapter on biblical studies as someone who's not a trained biblical scholar. One reason I do this is that my own sort of journey toward taking an interest in this character trait historically went in this way. I became interested in thinking about other-centeredness because I thought that it made sense to interpret some certain key biblical texts as expressing sympathy with this ideal. Well, it's not just kind of telling my own story. If that story's true, then I was thinking perhaps that actually provides a kind of useful model for virtue theorists. Not that this is the only way to engage with religious traditions for the purposes of virtue theoretic work, but it's one way you can. Namely, the way is you engage carefully with extant scholarship on foundational religious texts with an eye toward identifying potentially unique, distinctive insights that those texts might have that would be of interest not only to people within those religious traditions, but far outside them as well. Attempting to sort of identify traits that may be in view in those texts, and then you can further theorize about them, both as a philosopher, as a scientist, etc. And that's really what I try to do here in the book. So the purpose of this chapter is to argue that there's a plausible interpretation of certain key New Testament texts, according to which they are speaking favorably of this ideal of other-centeredness as articulated in the first chapter. The text on which I focus for the greatest percentage of time in the chapter is a text from Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. One translation, the New American Standard Version, puts it this way: "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves." If you look to other English translations, you find very similar expressions of what's in view in the text there. My suggestion is that a plausible interpretation, I won't insist it's the only plausible interpretation, I think it's one plausible interpretation of the text, has a lot going for it in my opinion, is that this text, and in fact much of Philippians as a letter, encourages the pursuit and possession and exercise of other-centeredness. The way in which I try to defend this in the chapter is by arguing that a plausible interpretation of this text, this is a plausible interpretation because, on the one hand, it resolves a kind of interesting philosophical puzzle that the text raises. I won't get into that in the talk. But secondly, this interpretation is confirmed by contemporary interpretive scholarship on the text. And I really think that the heavy weight of the argument rests with the work of the biblical scholars there. So just to give you a bit of a flavor of some of this contemporary interpretive scholarship that confirms this reading, here are a few quotations. So one author says, "The term tapaina forsune, translated humility of mind, denotes other person-centeredness. The passage is, quote, an admonition to focus one's attention on the interests of others." Gordon Fee says, "We are to consider others in our caring for them and are putting them and their needs ahead of our own. It is not so much that others in the community are thought of as better than I am, but as those whose needs and concerns surpass my own. Others, not we, have priority," Ruman writes. "That person's," that is, the other person's, "well-being provides a norm for community relationships." Sidney Park, in a book-length treatment of the theme of submission in the book of Philippians, says this: "The chief aspect in this submission is the primacy of others over and above and possibly at the risk of the self. Submissions in Philippians is depicted primarily as selflessness." So very briefly, I focus a lot on Philippians 2:3. Look also elsewhere in Philippians, but then also identify some textual and thematic parallels between this key text and other places in the New Testament. There are some very close textual parallels elsewhere in the Pauline corpus, and you can also find thematic parallels in the Synoptic Gospels and in the foot-washing narrative in John 13. So turn to the value of other-centeredness. My aim in this third chapter is to argue that there is a prima facie plausible case to be made on behalf of the positive normative status of other-centeredness from multiple distinct perspectives on normative ethics. My thought here is something like this. What I would like to do is I would like to make a broad appeal on behalf of the value of other-centeredness. Broad in the sense of trying to appeal to people who might hold quite different basic moral commitments to different moral theories. And so what I try to do in this chapter is to identify resources from within the three major branches of normative theory that could be used to generate an argument on behalf of the positive normative status of other-centeredness, whether it's morally required or morally permissible or supererogatory or virtuous. Now, I can't go through, that's a big chapter. Actually, all of these are kind of big chapters. But I can't go through all the details, but I'll do some examples. So I have the last one, actually, in the book, the last one that I examine is the resources from virtue ethics that could be used to defend the positive normative status of other-centeredness. But I start with this because I think it's just so easy to grasp the argument. Here's a particular example of a kind of virtue ethics, exemplarist virtue ethics. Perhaps especially appropriate here at this conference. The argument would go like this. Given exemplarism, if other-centeredness explains behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny, then other-centeredness is a virtue. But other-centeredness does explain behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny. So given exemplarism, other-centeredness is a virtue. Now, it should be noted about this argument in particular, all of them I actually say this about. Note the prima facie plausible case. But especially about this one, this argument is open to further empirical scrutiny. I mean, you can always do more work to try to be sure if other-centeredness is doing the explanatory work that I'm suggesting it might be doing. And in fact, my suggestions here are pretty tentative. But I do try to identify some potential cases of behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny, where there is some reason to think that other-centeredness could be playing a role in having brought those behaviors about. So a few examples. One is the behavior of exemplars identified in the book of Philippians. So if I'm correct in my interpretation of the Philippians 2:3 text that I mentioned a moment ago, it turns out that the book of Philippians is actually commonly read as a hortatory letter of friendship. And in the way that the letter functions, it has this key moral teaching, which comes at Philippians 2:3. And this key moral teaching is illustrated several times throughout the book with examples of particular people who are supposed to either instantiate this teaching or sort of run counter to it. We get both. So if those, and some of those exemplars, there's Jesus, there's Paul more than once, Timothy, Epaphroditus. If any of these people are displaying behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny, and if it's the case that they are doing this in part because they are other-centered, then they would be relevant examples. A couple of other potential examples, the rescuers, such as the rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust, and their classic text on this topic, the O-liners, say that one of the key features that made a difference between rescuers and non-rescuers was that rescuers were characterized by what they call values of care as opposed to values of equity. And when they describe what these values of care and values of equity are, they use language that's very reminiscent of other-centeredness. So they say, while equity asks that we act out of a sense of self-interest as well as the interests of others, care focuses on the interests of others. Others rather than self were the primary focus for rescuers. Just want to check my time. Also, just very briefly, some subjects of contemporary exemplarist research may also fit this bill. So in some of his research, Larry Walker and Jeremy Freimer and colleagues have noted a kind of pattern that moral exemplars exhibit in that the way in which they integrate the motives of agency and communion. They tend to instrumentalize their agentic motives to their communal motives. And at a very, very abstract sort of level, you might think of the motives of communion as motives to benefit others, motives aimed at the interests of others, and motives of agency as motives pertaining to advancing the interests of self. And so insofar as you think that your terminal ends you treat as you are more strongly motivated to achieve those terminal ends than you are your instrumental ends. Here, perhaps, again, is another case where we have people who are prioritizing the interests of others over their own, they're sort of more strongly motivated by the interests of others than by their own interests. A second example, try to go this a little more quickly. Expected value consequentialism. The argument would go like this: given expected value consequentialism, one ought to have a stronger preference for promoting an interest given just that it is another's than given just that it is one's own, if the expected value of promoting an interest is greater given just that the interest is another's than given just that it is one's own. But the expected value of promoting an interest is greater given just that the interest is another's than given just that it is one's own. So given expected value consequentialism, one ought to, in other words, be other-centered. Key premise, again, is the second one. Why think that the expected value of promoting an interest is greater given just that the interest is someone else's than given just that it's one's own? The key ideas here are these. First, that interpersonal unions are valuable. Interpersonal unions are ways in which persons can be united to one another. Examples include unions of friendship, cooperation, second-person knowledge and experience, to draw on the work of Eleanor Stump, and the bond of indebtedness to work on, to draw on some work by Robert Roberts. If you think that interpersonal unions are valuable, then I think, if you'll agree with that, then I think that there's a consequentialist case that can be given in favor of the positive normative status of other-centeredness, so long as you will also grant that the expected value of the unions you will promote by promoting an interest is greater, given just that the interest is another's than given just that it is one's own. The thought is basically this: there's a kind of asymmetry between promoting an interest of another versus promoting an interest of the self. Whenever you promote an interest for another person, you're sort of automatically going to end up promoting interpersonal union, whereas that's not the case with the self. And more generally, you can expect a greater volume of union to be promoted when you promote an interest for someone else than when you promote an interest for yourself. And that's how you sort of get yourself going on that road toward a consequentialist account of the positive normative status of other-centeredness. Right. Fourth chapter is concerned with objections to other-centeredness. My aim here is to respond to some salient objections to the value of attempting to cultivate or exercise other-centeredness. And in the process, I end up refining the original definition that I gave you of other-centeredness, kind of specifying some of its key components in a different way. One objection goes like this: being other-centered is impossibly altruistic. It's a waste of time to try to cultivate other-centeredness. The response that I spend time developing for this objection is to argue that being other-centered is not impossibly altruistic. It's in fact compatible with an ultimately egoistic eudaimonist ethic, given a suitable restriction on the scope of interest with which it is concerned. So I want to argue that we could think of other-centeredness as a virtue that is partially constitutive of a person's overall well-being. We might even imagine that the other-centered person puts others' interests above her own, in part for the sake of achieving her own overall well-being, that just in putting others' interests ahead of her own, just like everything else she does, she aims ultimately at her own overall well-being. And I think that if we grant that, it will help. It doesn't completely get rid of the objection, but it will help with this worry that other-centeredness is impossibly altruistic. I'm going to skip over some details here. The second objection, exercising other-centeredness leads one to self-neglect, which ultimately undermines even one's ability to help others. If I go around putting others ahead of myself all the time, I'm going to damage myself to such an extent that I won't even be able to care for others anymore. It's a basic concern. There are a number of ways of motivating that kind of concern. The one that I focus on in that chapter, I'm engaging primarily with 20th century feminist theological critiques of agapist theology. My response to this objection is as follows. having a tendency to treat an interest as more important given that it is another's than given that it is one's own does not require neglecting further facts regarding how promoting that interest would affect one's own long-term well-being. By virtue of being other-centered, I have to count the fact that an interest is yours rather than mine as counting favorably toward promoting it. But it's not the case that by virtue of being other-centered, I need to neglect all kinds of other facts. Right? And in particular, I don't need to neglect facts about whether promoting this interest would somehow injure my own long-term well-being. There's a lot more that can be said there, but I'll leave it at that for our purposes. Okay, chapter 5. Here, I want to kind of map out the relationship between other-centeredness and other putative virtues to which it is similar and vices to which it is opposed. By doing so, I hope that we can get a kind of partial account of how other-centeredness might function within the overall profile of the perfectly virtuous person. So I defend a few key claims in the chapter. First, I argue that other-centeredness is not identical to any putative virtue identified by contemporary virtue theorists. So I'm focusing narrowly on the work of contemporary virtue theorists who focus on conceptualizing the nature of traits. And so I'm looking mainly at the work of philosophers here. And I focus on the various accounts, and there have been various accounts of each of these, various accounts of humility, generosity, and love. And I look at all of these accounts and try to argue that other-centeredness is not identical to the traits that are identified by any of these accounts of these traits. Second key claim is that other-centeredness is also not just not identical to them, but it's relatively cardinal in the structure of virtue. So you might have wondered, does other-centeredness sort of reduce somehow to one of these other traits? Is it some kind of a specialization of one of these traits? For the most part, I defend the conclusion that that's not the case. I think other-centeredness, in many instances, actually, other-centeredness is the one that could be defended as being more cardinal than some of these other traits. I think it's relatively cardinal in the structure of the overall virtuous person's virtue. And then the last claim is that by understanding the nature of other-centeredness, we can illuminate the nature of contrary vices such as envy and greed. So just to give you a bit of the flavor of some of the work that I do in the chapter, I'll give you a kind of very brief overview of what I say about one of these traits, which is humility. So taking the example of humility, and I should say this, by the way, I'm very friendly toward the idea that other-centeredness is a version of humility. Right? Maybe it's the version of humility that's in view in the Philippians text. I'm friendly toward thinking that other-centeredness is a version of love or a version of generosity. It's just, my thesis in this chapter is just that it's not the versions of those traits that contemporary virtue theorists have been talking about. And the reason I care about that is I'm just trying to show, look, this is something genuinely novel and relatively fundamental for us to talk about. Okay. So with respect to humility, contemporary philosophical accounts of humility tend to identify humility with an orientation toward one's own valuable or disvaluable features or toward others' relations to those features. So for some examples, so we have the tendency to underestimate one's own valuable features, the tendency to be unimpressed with one's valuable features, the tendency to own one's limitations. Maybe that's not disvaluable. Okay. The tendency to be unconcerned with whether others regard one's features well. The tendency to be concerned that others receive equitable credit for one's achievements. Right? Those all sort of fit in those categories. But as such, these accounts all differ from other-centeredness in a couple of fundamental ways. By being focused on how a person is oriented toward her own features, either sort of directly, like how she's oriented toward them, or how she's oriented toward others' orientations toward them. Ultimately, kind of interest in her features. and by being a kind of backward looking. So these traits all they tell us about how a person is oriented toward ways that she is or ways that she was, right? Whereas other-centeredness is quite sort of forward-looking. It tells it's a tendency that regulates how one behaves in light of one's evidence regarding one's potential actions and how they will affect oneself or others for good or ill. Very forward-looking trait. Nonetheless, there's overlap. Actually, as I already mentioned, overlap between these traits, and the overlap can, in fact, that's where you start to see that other-centeredness may, in fact, be more cardinal than some of these other traits. I think I'll skip those details, though. Okay. Last chapter. Again, stepping way outside my comfort zone. I'm doing biblical studies and theology, and now I'm doing, I don't know what I'm doing. It's a silly philosopher. The last chapter is on the science of other-centeredness. I'm focused primarily on the psychological and personality and social psychological literature. And my aim in the chapter is to situate the scientific study of other-centeredness within contemporary scientific research projects, to identify plausible psychological and social predictors and predictions of other-centeredness on the basis of existing scientific research, and to identify promising avenues for future scientific study of other-centeredness. So we'll start with the situating. Now, why am I situating? Well, the reason I'm situating, and what I mean by that is I'm saying, like, here's where the scientific study of other-centeredness would fit. And the reason I'm saying that is because, as far as I know, the scientific study of other-centeredness as such does not exist. So instead, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, well, if there were to be a scientific study of other-centeredness, here is where it would fit within some ongoing scientific research paradigms. There are some clear places where it does seem to fit well, and my thought is that if there are psychologists who are interested in studying traits in these domains, and other-centeredness is another trait in these domains, but it's different from the other ones, then maybe these psychologists would also take an interest in studying other-centeredness. So, 3 examples. Other-centeredness is an example of a hypoegoic trait. A lot of interest in hypoegoic traits. Recent publication of the Oxford Handbook of Hypoegoic Phenomena. Specifically, other-centeredness is an example of a hypoegoistic trait. Hypoegoism is low egoistic processing. This is low processing. Egoistic processing is processing that involves placing a precedence on one's own outcomes over the outcomes of others. So it's kind of clear that other-centeredness would be an example of a hypoegoistic phenomenon. But it's not the same hypoegoistic phenomenon as others that have been identified so far. It's an example of a communal orientation. There's a long history, sort of important paradigm for psychological research that examines the motives of agency and communion. I think I actually mentioned that already. And there are sort of more strongly communal orientations, right? There's a family of more strongly communal orientations. Other-centeredness is, I would think, an example of a more strongly communal orientation, but it's not identical to other more strongly communal orientations that have been studied so far. So, for example, there is a construct called unmitigated communion that received, sorry, let me check. All right. There's a construct called unmitigated communion. It clearly overlaps with other-centeredness. So here's some items from the scale used to measure unmitigated communion. You think, item 1, that looks really similar to other-centeredness. I always place the needs of others above my own. But other items in the scale, they don't look so much like other-centeredness. I worry about how other people get along without me. So overlap but difference. I suggest on the basis of existing scientific research that we can draw some tentative conclusions about what we might expect would predict other-centeredness in a person's life, and what we might expect would predict, what we might expect other-centeredness would predict would come into a person's life. So potential predictors of other-centeredness, these include secure attachments, lack of self-preoccupation, high empathic concern, an expansive sense of social responsibility. These are all predictors of pro-social behavior. Other-centeredness conceptually would predict high incidence of prosocial behavior. And so as long as these predictors of prosocial behavior are not the sort of predictors that would predict prosocial behavior in a way that would exclude other-centeredness, I think there's a decent presumptive reason to think that they would be predictive of other-centeredness. Predictions, a similar kind of route can be taken. And then last thing, future avenues. Try to offer some proposals in that chapter about how to develop some self-report, other report scales, and some behavioral measures of other-centeredness. So very much looking forward toward hopefully collaborating in future research on the topic. Thanks. So I think I saw your hand first.
All right, thank you, Ryan. This seems like a really interesting project. This is just a clarification. I think there were two ambiguities in the way you characterize other-centeredness. So one ambiguity is you might think it's a tendency to treat what actually are the interests of other people's as more important than one's own actual interests. Or it could be that you treat what you take to be other people's interests. So like the objective-subjective distinction.
Right.
And then another ambiguity is it like people's long-term interests or like the proximate interests that are the relevant ones?
Yeah, great. Both good questions. So the way that I try to address the objective, I address it directly, the objective-subjective question in the first chapter. I like subjectivist views, and so I give some reasons for why I like those views, but at the same time, for purposes of the book, they don't make a whole lot of difference, and so I try to point that out, and so say to my friends who like objectivist views better, here's how you conceptualize an objectivist version of this trait. Here are some places where it might make some difference in the book, but please sort of tolerate me and come along and look at the rest of the book with me. That's kind of my approach to that. And then the question about shorter term versus longer term interests. This concerns the scope of interests. So what all interests are you meaning to include when you say that you put the interests of others ahead of your own? Each and every interest of whatever kind. The only restriction that I propose in the book regarding that is a restriction that I sort of pointed to but didn't say anything about in the talk, which I talk about in the fourth chapter in response to the objection about impossible altruism. So I suggest that if you want to adopt a eudaemonist view and claim that the others-centered do all that they do, including putting others' interests ahead of their own, for the sake of achieving their own well-being, that's going to force you, in order to maintain conceptual coherence, it's going to force you to limit the scope of the interest. So for example, you wouldn't say that the others-centered do all that they do for the sake of promoting their own well-being, and they put the overall well-being of others above their overall well-being. There's a conceptual incoherence there, I think. And so I propose some restriction. The restriction I propose is that they put the interests of all others except for those interests that include other-centeredness as a component. Overall well-being, on this view anyway, is included with, includes other-centeredness as a component. So that's sort of what I'd say about that. I saw a hand here. Yeah.
Thanks. That was really interesting. I had kind of a similar question, though not. I'm going to pose it as an objection, but maybe it's just asking for a clarification. So it seems like there might be issues about that other-centeredness might be overly paternalistic in the sense that whether you're promoting either what you take to be the interest of the other person or their actual interest, that might diverge from what they're interested in doing. So that's the kind of shallow version of the objection. It's a sort of deeper, murkier version, which is I can imagine a version of other-centeredness which would look kind of arrogant, where I look upon everyone else as a receptacle of value, but I'm different. I'm the person who's supposed to go fill those receptacles of value. And so it's a kind of exceptionalism about yourself, and that seems much less appealing than I think probably a lot of the examples of other-centeredness you were thinking about.
Okay. Yeah, let me try to do the first one first. Yeah, this kind of concern about, so I don't know if this will get exactly what you want, but I mentioned two objections that I deal with from that fourth chapter. One having to do with impossible altruism, the other having to do with self-harm. There's another one that I deal with at some length as well that I decided not to include. And it's the objection that, look, the other-centered are going to end up giving help that hurts. And so I do a whole lot to engage with this psychological literature on helping and how difficult it is to give help that actually helps, and how all these ways in which help can go wrong, and right? And so I kind of think about, okay, if the other-centered person is someone who's disposed to treat others' interests as more important than their own, given just that they're others and independently of any further facts about these others, gosh, aren't they going to kind of like get themselves in all kinds of trouble? I mean, all these facts, in fact, matter when you get help. My response to that is very similar to the response that I gave to the worry about self-harm, and it's that while other-centeredness directs you to pay attention to whose interests are whose, right, it does not direct you to not pay attention to these further facts. And so I'll say that I would say, well, I put it kind of this way in the book, that being other-centered can lead to help that hurts. It can lead to bad outcomes if it's not accompanied by other valuable traits and a cooperative environment. I think similar things are true. This sort of speaks to an issue that Christian brought up yesterday. So I'm kind of putting my cards on the table about that issue. So I think that might be true of other virtues as well, is what I suggest. The receptacles of value one. I'm not sure I understand the question or objection very well. It sounds like it might have something to do with the reasons for which the person is putting others' interests first, something like that.
Well, the thought is that, there's one model of thinking about our ethical demands, which is they arise from a cooperative project. You and I are working together to see what we owe each other. That's one way of thinking about it. Your picture doesn't, other-centeredness seems to be rather at odds with that, because there's an asymmetry between myself and the other people. And usually that looks great when I'm like trying to help them, but there's a way in which I become active and they become passive on that model, which some people might be bothered by. Those people who like the model of ethics that's cooperative rather than me trying to like help out other people.
Okay.
That was, you don't need to really respond. It was just to sort of like motivate a kind of reluctance.
Okay, I'll try to think more about it. Happy to chat more about it as well. Thanks. Yeah, Christian.
So the science chapter, I see you talk about the Big Five, and you talk about the VIA, and I don't think you'll find other-centeredness in either of them, but just want to make sure that you.
I sort of briefly refer to other constructs like that in the Hexaco model, but it's not a thorough engagement in the way I engage with some of the other stuff more thoroughly, because there was direct overlap in the items and the scales, but yeah.
So another question coming up, but just altruism under agreeableness, the passive altruism under agreeableness in the Big Five, and then kindness and love in amongst the 24 character strengths in the VIA. You should probably say why they're not other-centered. So then the main question is, in your characterization, you're giving a characterization of a character trait here, but you don't, when you give us the characterization, it wasn't of a virtue. And one reason I wouldn't want to think of it as a virtue is it doesn't have a motivational condition on it. So all we're given here is just a kind of behavior, pattern of behavior, and it's silent on what the motivating reasons could be for that behavior, so it's quite compatible with crudely altruistic, crudely egoistic motives. So do you, in that chapter, go on to give a motivational condition?
I'm not sure how happy you would be with it, but I do sort of engage with this question of, well, so Candace Vogler has this example where she says, actually, she mentioned this at the last conference, I think, where she talks about I could go in for, being all kinds of pro-social because I'm terrified of my fellow human beings. I'm trying to sort of disarm them. You might imagine someone that, well, yeah, I go around putting everyone's interests first, putting them above my own because I'm so terrified they're going to be out to get me. So there's a way that I do try to address that, but I'm not sure how satisfying it would be for you. My way of addressing it is with the just because condition. So my thought is that the person who's putting others' interests first because of a concern that others are out to get them is not putting others' interests first just because they're others. That was my thought. Yeah.
I really appreciate your talk. Thanks for it. It's very thought-provoking, especially for Christian ethicists. One critique that some Christian ethicists had of ethics centered upon the other, like say Emmanuel Levinas's ethics, is that the other becomes too indeterminate, so it can become hard to know when that other is exploitative, as opposed to affirming of, or like inclusive of your own of your own flourishing as well. So I guess I was wondering whether you integrated something like the picture in Matthew 25 with the parable of the sheep and the goats, and where the motivation for being other-centeredness is made explicit within the Christian perspective, that it's not just an indeterminate other that you see just because they're other, but because you have a positive object of love whose image that other person bears. And Matthew 25, it's not even really, or it's not only the other person that you're helping, but it's the righteous judge himself. So I don't know how you would, what you think about that, but is there any sort of worry there that, like, without any kind of content, the other that you could be putting before your own could be somebody who's quite willing to consume you and any others who may come along with that same sort of intention.
Okay. Yeah. Great. There's sort of a lot in that comment question. I do engage with the idea of whether the particular features of the other might matter, and so here it's the example of particular features where features of, well, what if the other's sort of quite willing to consume you and others. That very way of thinking comes across in some of the literature that I engage with when I engage with the agapist theology. So, sorry, I'm forgetting the author's name, but he very much thinks in this way and is concerned about sort of being taken advantage of in this way. And what I say about that is very similar to what I've said about the objection from self-harm and the objection of offering help that hurts, is that the other-centered person is not such that by virtue of her other-centeredness she neglects facts about particular others. So it's not something to require that she not pay attention to whether they're out to get me or not, right? And so this can have implications as well. I don't know if you were maybe were interested in this question as well, but this can have implications for whether the other-centered can sort of have special relationships. Lots of people are interested in that, have asked me about that. And so one thing that I say about that is that that putting others first in the way that other-centeredness requires does not require not putting some others before others. I don't know if that was enough to respond.
One last question.
In the back?
Do you engage at all with medieval discussions of the Ordo Amoris, the priorities of love, and the strong tendency in people, not tendency, the strong position of people like Aquinas, where the order goes God, self, other, and then you've got a whole structuring of others in terms of proximity, right? And it seems to me that Aquinas' argument about self-love turns on his understanding of the nature of desire, right? So I can't desire a good for another unless I myself find that good desirable. Now, in terms of your actions, you might, give up some good to give to the other. But for Aquinas, there would be certain goods you couldn't give up, such as your own salvation, right? You can, actually, he also considers the body, your own body, a kind of an other too, so, which has lower priority than the neighbor. So that's why you can be a martyr. But a la Shusaku Endo's silence, you could never give up your own salvation for another. So it's, for Aquinas at least, there's some goods that you desire, well, all goods you desire for the other because you desire it for yourself, but there's some goods you could never sacrifice for yourself for the sake of the other. So do you engage that tradition at all?
Yeah, great question. The quick answer is no. I don't engage with that. I'm currently sort of working in some brief discussion of a structurally similar kind of question, which is a question about whether, so earlier in response to Walter, I mentioned that I talked about how we might have some restriction on the scope of the interests that are put first. And there are some philosophers who've expressed sympathy with the idea that, well, there are other interests that need to go there too, like maybe developing your own talents or some kind of ground project that you just couldn't put someone else's ground projects above your own ground projects because they give your life meaning. And I think the salvation question is structurally similar. So I'm going to be working through what to say about those issues right now.
Okay.
Did you say that was?